Jake approached where Chanty and David were lying down. David remained lying with his eyes closed next to Chanty, who was unaware of what was happening around her. Jake observed Chanty, her expression blank. "Should we wake her up?" David said. Even though his eyes were closed, he knew Jake was staring at them, especially Chanty, whom Jake was closely observing. Suddenly, Jake glanced at Justin, who was saying something only Jake could hear. Justin gave Jake a meaningful look while grinning mischievously, to which Jake responded with an equally intense gaze. Meanwhile, David, seated beside Chanty, kept shifting his gaze between Justin and Jake, who were exchanging intense looks. David sensed Justin communicating with Jake telepathically. He tried to gauge Jake's every reaction. Justin burst into laughter. "Wake her up. She needs to see the truth. It's time for her to know everything," Marco interjected, standing and approaching David. Justin also moved closer, waiting for what would happen next. Justin, Marco, and Jake stood around Chanty with serious expressions. David glanced at the three young men around him one by one and nodded, signaling that he would wake up Chanty. With that, he gently touched Shanty's forehead and stood up. He waited for Chanty to wake up, with the four of them surrounding her about 2 meters away. After a moment, Chanty took a deep breath, gasping for air and coughing forcefully. She was struggling, holding her chest as her breathing normalized. Despite the darkness, she could make out a light coming from a big fire. "Fire! Fire! There's a fire!" Chanty screamed, panicked and scared, her emotions swirling. She didn't know what to do. There was a large fire nearby, explaining the heat she felt. Frantically, Chanty rubbed her eyes to see her surroundings clearly. Her eyes widened as she realized the magnitude of the situation. The mansion was on fire. She covered her mouth with her hands, screaming, "Papa! Papa!" amidst loud sobs and cries. She wanted to approach the burning mansion, but after a few steps, she couldn't bear the heat. "Papa! Papa!" Chanty continued to scream with all her might. "Yaya! Yaya! Why? What happened?" Chanty muttered to herself. She tried to recall the events before this moment, tears streaming down her face as she remembered. She was supposed to enter the mansion when suddenly she tripped because of an eagle's cry. Chanty remembered that moment. She suddenly remembered being surrounded by strong wind and swirling smoke, then she passed out. "David! Justin!
Marco!"
Chanty shouted, her body spinning as she desperately searched for the three young men. She kept wailing and calling for her father and Nanny Maria, asking for forgiveness for not being able to do anything.
"Papa!
Please forgive me. I couldn't do anything." Chanty was losing strength, her knees giving in as she collapsed onto the grass where she had awakened earlier. She buried her face in the grass, sobbing uncontrollably, letting out all the pain, longing, and frustration she felt because she couldn't bear it anymore. She kept crying out for her father and Nanny. Chanty didn't know that the four young men were watching her from a distance, allowing her to grieve and release her emotions. They observed her silently, without moving. While Chanty's face was buried in her hands, sobbing, she suddenly remembered her horse, Rhonda. "Rhonda!" Chanty muttered to herself. She quickly got up, almost tripping as she ran to where she last left Rhonda. With Mr. Arnold's horse, she knew she had left Rhonda tied to a post near the mansion's gate. Chanty ran, calling out Rhonda's name, hoping to hear her, but no horse approached her. All she heard was the crackling of the fire engulfing the mansion's surroundings. She ran to the stable near the large pond to check if Rhonda was there, but she wasn't. Chanty cried again, screaming for Rhonda. The only living memory from her mother was gone. There was nothing left of her mother's memory. Chanty's body collapsed in despair over her missing horse. The pain she felt was immeasurable. If only that night could take away her grief, The pain of losing loved ones was so unbearable, it felt like it might kill her. She spotted near the garage that the 3 expensive cars of 3 young men, David, Marco, and Justin, were also on fire. Why was the fire causing so much damage, even reaching the surroundings? Chanty couldn't understand what was happening, as if it rained fire. Even the river had fire around it. Where did the fire come from? What caused the fire? Endless questions filled Shanta's mind. She longed for answers to these events. She waited for the firefighters to arrive. She was sure her neighbors knew about the fire. Even though they were far from the houses, someone must have reported it. She waited for the firefighters to arrive. Chanty mournfully watched from afar as the mansion was slowly consumed by fire. The gazebo, swimming pool, and guest house next to the mansion were gone too. In Shanta's mind, the mystery deepened even more because she saw no burnt bodies of people or animals around. They had many horses, not just Rhonda. Where were the other horses? Did they run and all survive? Chanty wondered. In her last memory, she saw some housemaids come out to look at the eagle flying in the sky. She remembered everything before she fainted. Where were the people around? Why was she the only one left alone? The surroundings were getting clearer as the fire grew larger. Chanty moved further away because of the thick smoke. She also felt the weakness in her body, perhaps from crying. Her thirst intensified. She desperately searched for somewhere to drink water. The river was the only option she could think of. She walked slowly towards it. As she headed towards the river, Chanty looked around the mansion, her tears flowing again. She felt extreme sadness at that moment. She kept mentioning her father, Nanny Maria, and Rhonda. Chanty continued towards the river. The surroundings were somewhat dark, but she could still see the path because of the fire's light. Chanty, extremely thirsty, drank water from the river. She wasn't sure if the water was clean. She couldn't see the state of the water clearly. She also washed her face. She realized she hadn't changed clothes since she rode the horse. Chanty only heard the sound of the river during those moments. She was staring blankly at the flowing water, the vastness of the sky reflected in the river. Unknowingly, tears flowed again. She felt extreme sadness once more. Chanty continued staring at the river. Slowly, Chanty submerged herself in the middle of the river. Could the river drown the pain in her chest? Chanty stopped when she felt the depth of the water past her waist. She felt the coldness of the water, her clothes soaked. She submerged her entire body in the water. She hoped that, even temporarily, the cold water would ease the sadness she felt from losing loved ones. Papa, Yaya, Rhonda, forgive me, I couldn't do anything, Chanty whispered to herself, crying. Mama, forgive me. Chanty murmured to herself. Chanty held her breath underwater. Suddenly, a figure of a man jumped into the river where Chanty was and lifted her out of the water. Chanty was shocked by what was happening. All she felt was extreme surprise and worry. She couldn't explain the fear she felt. She felt surprised as if they were floating in the air. She couldn't move as her body was lifted. She couldn't believe what her eyes were showing her. Were they really floating in the air? She couldn't speak. It was like she was mute. Slowly, she was lowered to the ground. And standing beside her, it just stared at her without saying a word. Chanty's eyes widened in shock, her voice trembling. Who are you? She felt cold, sensing the chill of the surroundings, perhaps because she was soaked, her whole body. She knew a man had lifted her, but she couldn't see his face clearly. She could see that his body was muscular, wearing a long jacket, with long hair reaching his shoulder, but half of his hair was tied in a bun. She could discern from the silhouette. Her eyes were getting used to the darkness, but the light from the fire from the big mansion also helped her see her surroundings that night. Who are you? Chanty asked, stepping back slightly. She knew her voice was trembling, perhaps from the cold she felt and the fear of the moment. She felt defenseless against whatever the man in front of her would do. Her body weakened, trembling uncontrollably, and she couldn't even control the shaking. The man seemed about to approach her, but Chanty also moved backward. "Don't come any closer," Chanty shouted, her voice almost hoarse, unsure if her words were being heard. "Are you mute? I've been asking you who you are," she added. "You suddenly appeared out of nowhere, and I don't know you. Are you a firefighter? But based on what you're wearing, you're not one," Chanty said, trying to make out the face of the person in front of her. She knew he was staring at her seriously, just observing her every move and listening. Soon enough, the man took off his jacket, causing Chanty's expression to panic even more at his actions. Before she could speak, the man had already taken off the jacket and threw it at her. Chanty couldn't understand, but she quickly caught the man's jacket. "Put it on," the man ordered, his voice deep and authoritative. "We both soaked in water, but this jacket dries fast. It'll remove the cold you're feeling," he explained. Why was her fear dissipating? His voice sounded like music to her ears. Why was she thinking like this? Chanty stared at the jacket she held for a moment. Should she wear it? Even though she didn't know the person in front of her? Maybe the man was just being kind, passing by her by the river? That's the possible reason Chanty thought of why this man was in front of her. Did he think she was drowning? Is that why he saved her? Whatever the reason, she knew she needed the jacket at that moment. She couldn't control the trembling of her body. She quickly put on the jacket and hugged herself while wearing it. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. She heard the man chuckle. He still hadn't taken his gaze off her. Chanty gradually felt the warmth returning to her body, the cold she felt disappearing. The jacket felt so comfortable on her skin, she didn't feel her clothes underneath being wet anymore. She then noticed that the jacket, although large, was not heavy. Almost like she wasn't wearing a jacket at all. Indeed, it was a special jacket she was wearing. She couldn't admit it, but the jacket smelled so good. She only smelled this fragrance now. It felt so good, she couldn't explain it. She felt embarrassed by her thoughts. Why was she thinking like this when she didn't even know the person she was talking to? She tried to remind herself. "Jake, that's what you can call me," the man in front of her said. "Jake?" Chanty replied. "Thank you, Jake, but you're wrong if you think I'm drowning. I just want to momentarily get rid of the heaviness I feel in my chest," Chanty explained. She tried to speak clearly for Jake to hear. She knew she was hoarse from crying and maybe from the smoke too, which might have caused her temporary loss of voice. "Don't speak anymore, you don't need to explain to me," Jake said, approaching Chanty. "Let's go." Before Chanty could respond or move, Jake lifted her, and they floated in the air. Soaring upwards, Chanty covered her mouth in astonishment, her eyes widening in shock. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. They were really flying, levitating in the air, and approaching the mansion. She couldn't believe her eyes. Her vision wasn't deceiving her. Jake was looking down while Chanty was in shock, staring at Jake's face. But Jake didn't pay attention to her, knowing that Jake could feel Chanty's surprise, but he didn't even care. Chanty gradually felt Jake's body warmth as he held her. She felt they were descending without even looking down. Afraid she couldn't handle the nervousness, so she closed her eyes as they descended. When they landed, Jake let go of her and she stood up. It was only then that Chanty opened her eyes, looking around immediately, her face showing surprise, disbelief, and confusion. She couldn't utter a word. What would she say to this person? What would she ask him? Everything seemed not to register in her mind. She gazed at the burning mansion in the distance. Where did Jake take her? She thought they were approaching the mansion, but all she could see was the mansion on the hill, now burning and surrounded by firefighters she could see from where she stood. 3 fire trucks. It was only then that she noticed the moonlight, What time was it now? And the moon came out only a few nights before the full moon. She felt her tears about to fall again. She tried to hold them back at that moment. Her emotions were mixed in just one night. The fire and this man in front of her, flying. Were these events real? Really? Wasn't she going crazy? Chanty just stared at Jake. Who are you? And what are you? Chanty asked Jake. Do you have the power to fly? Am I not hallucinating? Am I going crazy? Chanty laughed, looking up at the sky. Is destiny playing with me? Jake remained staring at her without moving, not even a word. Under the moonlight, she could see Jake's face. It was clear to her how handsome he was, the kind she only saw in magazines, but even more so. Strikingly handsome was the right word to describe Jake's appearance. His long hair added to his appeal. He wore a black t-shirt that hugged his body and black pants that hugged his thighs. He is tall. There was an aura about him like a cold person. Even though she wanted to read Jake's character, she couldn't until he himself would tell her. Shortly after, Jake looked behind him and Chanty followed where Jake was looking. Chanty was even more surprised by what she saw. David, Marco, and Justin were approaching where Jake and Chanty were. The faces of the three young men were serious as they approached. David, Chanty exclaimed. She wanted to run and hug David out of extreme joy, but she tried to restrain herself. They're alive,